in Shakespearean English, 1,000 greetings, gentle traveller, thou art right welcome. That was AI's suggestion when I asked it how to say hello and welcome in Shakespearean English. And the reason I did that is because you are indeed welcome to the last in the Stratford-on-Avon mini-series that we've been doing here at City Breaks. After Stratford generally and Shakespeare Stratford, what else to end with but something on the theme of exploring theatre in Stratford? Because, you know, we've seen the house and the church and all of that, but really, the play's the thing. I believe those words may have been penned by the great man himself. And let's face it, he wrote over 1 million words of text, all sorts of themes and characters and plots and all that wonderful language in 38 different plays, comedies, histories, tragedies, all of which I believe have been staged at some point in time in Stratford-on-Avon. And how fitting, I thought, to finish the series with theatre. So I'm going to have a little look at theatre of a sort, as it was back in Shakespeare's day, a quick run through the history of Shakespearean theatre in Stratford, and then a look at all the places in the town that you can visit if you want to know more. So that will be 3 different theatres and a museum, all, I think, grouped together under the umbrella heading the Royal Shakespeare Theatre. So here goes then, a little history. Drama was thriving in Stratford when Shakespeare was a child, so we're talking the 1560s and 70s, because travelling acting companies visited the town. Before they were granted a licence to perform in town, they had to be vetted by the bailiff, the alderman, the common council, as I believe it was known. And there was even a point when John Shakespeare, so William's dad, was in charge of this vetting process. It took place usually in the Guildhall, so very difficult to imagine that Shakespeare wouldn't have had a look at least some of the occasions. We know, for example, that when he was aged between about 9 and 12, the most famous theatre company in England arrived in Stratford more than once. Lord Leicester's Men, they were called, and quite an illustrious company, able to charge apparently 3 times what ordinary companies could charge in order to watch their plays. They weren't the only players in town. Records show that at least 15 other companies visited Stratford during the years when Shakespeare was young. So the question is, did he watch, and did he find inspiration there? I think the official answer is maybe. My answer is surely he did. I also read something interesting in one of the guidebooks I came across. Quote, "The companies sometimes recruited local boys and young men to act in walk-on roles and perhaps assist backstage. If this happened in Stratford, William Shakespeare would probably have been a keen participant." Yes, indeed, and if you go on a tour round the Guildhall, they will show you a room upstairs which used to be called the agreeing room, so the room in which actors, before they did their performance, would meet to agree on exactly how they were going to perform in the space. I think it's a corruption of that word that gives us today's green room. And while we're on the subject of etymology, there was also, in theatres of the day, a tiring room, the room where the actors got changed into their costumes, taken from the word attire, presumably. Anyway, so he probably saw real actors at work. We know too that he probably watched court cases in the Guildhall, again, especially when his father was a magistrate. So maybe that gave him some ideas for high drama. And we know that his teachers, or some of them anyway, encouraged the boys in the school that he almost certainly attended to act out texts from Roman literature in their lessons. That must have filled young Shakespeare's mind with lots of ideas and characters and stories, and you can trace them sometimes. Pyramus and Thisbe, for example, that little interlude in Midsummer Night's Dream, that comes straight from the Latin author Ovid. And we can perhaps also imagine that maybe they read Cicero, and that from that Shakespeare picked up lots of ideas about the power of great oratory and how to write a really good speech. I found it interesting to note that Shakespeare's childhood was exactly the moment when theatre, as an actual building in which to perform plays, became a thing. Up until then, plays had been performed mainly in courtyards or perhaps in the grounds of a big house, where the lord or the earl in charge was a sponsor for theatre. But the very first theatre that opened in London opened in 1567, when Shakespeare was 3. That was the Red Lion Theatre in Whitechapel, by the way. So as he grew up, this would have been becoming a development, something he no doubt noticed and was keen to latch onto. And of course we know that a bit later in life, when he went to London, he founded firstly a theatre company, the Lord Chamberlain's Men, and also, a bit after that, the theatre, the Globe Theatre, which he was a co-founder and shareholder. Just as a mini digression, Elizabethan theatre was of course vastly different from theatre today. All the parts were played by men, for a start. Very little emphasis on scenery. I don't think they even had a curtain. Many of the audience came and stood, the groundlings as they were known, who could get in, for example, to the Globe Theatre on the South Bank in London for a penny each, or they could pay a bit more to sit up in the gallery, built one level up around the stage and the space for the groundlings. The performances were pretty different too. Lots of music, dancing, tumbling, wrestling, fights and duels. And we're not talking hushed, respectful audiences, we're talking raucous outbreaks, where people felt quite entitled to shout things out at the actors, or to buy snacks from passing vendors circulating amongst them, perhaps to overdo the alcohol and lose their inhibitions. I found a nice description of theatre in London in Shakespeare's day from Bernard Cornwell's book, Fools and Mortals. Here then is a quotation from that. The first playgoers began arriving before 1 o'clock. They came across Finsbury Fields, a trickle at first, but the trickle swelled as men, women, apprentices, tradesmen and gentry all came from the Cripplegate. Others walked up from the Bishopsgate and turned down the narrow path that led by the horse pond to the playhouse, where one-eyed Jeremiah stood at the entrance with a locked box that had a slit in its lid, and where two men, both armed with swords, cudgels and scowls, guarded the old soldier and his box. Every playgoer had to drop a penny through the slot. 3 whores from the Dolphin Tavern were selling hazelnuts just outside the theatre. Blind Michael, who was guarded by a huge deaf and dumb son, was selling oysters, and Pitchfork Harry sold bottles of ale. The crowd, as always, was in a merry mood. They greeted old friends, chatted and laughed as the yard filled. Richer folk went to the smaller door, paid 2pence, and climbed the stairs to the galleries, where, for yet another penny, they could hire a cushion to soften the oak benches. Stratford, in Shakespeare's day, of course, was quite the rural backwater, and it didn't happen immediately after his death that things took off. We know that really the first occasion when Stratford tried to make much of its connections to the great playwright was 1769, when the famous actor David Garrick organised a 3-day extravaganza known as the Shakespeare Jubilee. All sorts took place: horse racing, a masked ball, a grand dinner, fireworks, public reading of Garrick's Ode to Shakespeare. It was apparently quite the disaster because heavy wind and rain ruined everything, but it did put Stratford on the map, kind of establishing what today would be called the Shakespeare tourism industry. The idea of Stratford becoming the place to celebrate Shakespeare and all his works. But it was another century, the 1870s, until the Shakespeare Memorial Theatre was built, Stratford's first purpose-built theatre, which opened on the 23rd of April, an auspicious date, as I'm sure you remember, Shakespeare's possible birthday and definitely the day of his death, and the play performed was Much Ado About Nothing. Things didn't still get off to a very quick start. There were festival weeks here and there, until a few years later something happened to put Stratford on the map. There was a very popular young American actress, Mary Anderson, well known to London theatre audiences of the day, who was going to play Rosalind in As You Like It, and who asked, could she debut in Stratford instead of in London? Because she would attract large audiences, they had to agree, and things took off from there. The Memorial Theatre became very well used until one day in 1928, disaster struck and a fire more or less destroyed it. So it took a few years until 1932 for the new version to be built, known in fact for being designed by the first female architect who'd ever designed a public building, one Elizabeth Scott. And she came up with an Art Deco idea, at least as far as the frontage down by the river was concerned, and also some bits inside the foyer, for example. Her design of the auditorium was fairly conventional for the day, although definitely not Elizabethan in style. The audience would sit set back from the stage, in the stalls and in the balconies around it, definitely much more separated from the stage and the actors than had been the case in the Elizabethan theatre. In fact, some actors complained that it was, quote, like acting on the beach at Dover when the audience is in Calais. Nevertheless, the theatre went on to have a really illustrious history, all kinds of exciting productions, parts often played by the big actors of their day. Here, for example, is Nicholas Fogg, the author of the book Secret Stratford, giving his own personal highlights of the plays that were shown at this version of the theatre. He was the first to add, actually, that everyone would have their own list, but this is his. Quote, Laurence Olivier's Coriolanus with Edith Evans' Volumnia, Vanessa Redgrave's Rosalind, Donald Sinden's Othello, Peggy Ashcroft's all-day performance in The Wars of the Roses, the Lears of Paul Schofield and Robert Stevens, and Stevens's Falstaff, Peter Brook's Dream, The Much Ado of Derek Jacobi and Sinead Cusack, Kenneth Branagh's Hamlet. By the 1990s, however, the call was going out for a new theatre. Local people had been calling the old one the Jam Factory, but that didn't stop them protesting, along with many of the actors actually, when an extensive remodelling was proposed. In the end, it was done. The theatre shut for several years, reopening in 2010, for a massive makeover which cost £113 million. It saved some of the favourite bits of the previous version, the Art Deco bits, the fountain court, the marble staircase, the Art Deco foyer, for example, but it added a much more Elizabethan-style design. A few seats were lost, but a stage was constructed which could jut out much further into the audience and make for a much more intimate experience. Audiences would now sit on 3 sides of the stage, and 88% of them would be within 10 metres of the actors. So that's the version you'll see if you go on a visit today. And yes, guided tours are available, which I would highly recommend. You will see such facilities as the auditorium, of course. I don't know if you sometimes see the rehearsal spaces if they're not in use. You will be taken backstage and see where magic in terms of costumes and props and makeup take place. You'll see the laundry too, where all the costumes are washed, or in some cases steam cleaned. And you will be taken past the insult chair, where for a small fee you can sit down and be insulted. I made a little collection of some of the things that come out of its mouth. I do desire that we may be better strangers, you can say to someone whom you don't really wish to see again. Or perhaps if you really don't like them, you could say, you are a boil, a plague sore, an embossed carbuncle. You are a crusty botch of nature. You are a lump of foul deformity. And when you're done with being insulted, there are other less controversial facilities, a rooftop restaurant, a cafe, a shop with all manner of books and souvenirs and whatnot. Studying the annual programme of the Royal Shakespeare Theatre tells you lots about what it is they're trying to do. I had a look at the 24-25 version, which across all 3 theatres in Stratford was offering 6 Shakespeare plays, big hitters like King Lear, comedy such as The Merry Wives of Windsor. Often there's a history play in the mix too, although that year I don't think there was. But there were also 4 brand new plays, for example, an adaptation of a Hanif Qureshi novel, The Buddha of Suburbia, and another play set at the Kyoto Climate Conference. So it's not all and exclusively Shakespeare. They are giving a window to other drama too. There was a restoration comedy that season, and the retelling of the classic fairy tale, The Red Shoes. There were productions from visiting companies, such as the Northern Ballet, and the, I don't know if I can pronounce this, Uzhhorod Theatre from Ukraine. There was also, for the summer period, a cut-down 1-hour-long production of As You Like It, to be performed outside in the Swan Gardens. Often there are plays by Shakespeare's contemporaries, something by Marlowe perhaps, or Ben Jonson. Sometimes they do a suite of Shakespeare plays, for example Henry IV Parts 1 and 2 and Henry V, which tell one story really through the 3 plays. There are children's productions. There's been The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, for example, and when I visited they were doing a version of Roald Dahl's The BFG. Productions in the main theatre normally run for 6 to 8 weeks, a little less in the next door theatre, the Swan, perhaps 4 or 6 weeks. I actually did one of the guided tours, and and learnt loads. When we went into the auditorium, we were told about all the multiple entrance points for actors. Stage right and left, yep, seen that. Actors coming in from the back, you may have seen that. Along, and this is a wonderful word, the VOMS. That's VOMS, short for the wonderful Latin word vomitoria, which apparently means exits. Who knew? They're short walkways constructed from the back of the theatre along to the stage so that actors can appear, surprisingly, from behind you. We were shown how they can come down from the ceiling or up through trapdoors in the stage floor. And at every entrance there'll be red and green lights. The red light telling the actor they've got, I think maybe 30 seconds until they come on, and the green light saying, right, now, go. There were curtains all through the corridor, which runs around the outside of the auditorium, and there's a reason for that, because behind them are various little quick change areas, which I think you never would notice unless you'd had them pointed out to you. If an actor's got a very quick change to do, hasn't got time to go up to the dressing rooms, then they can do that here. Some of that same space is dedicated to something called a WHAM area, WHAM, which stands for wigs, hair and makeup. Again, if you have to do something to that quickly, mid-show, there's the place to do it. There were sound booths too, with a microphone and a script for voice-offs. So, for example, if a puppet is playing on stage, an actor will be in one of these little booths speaking the required lines. They have a screen in front of them showing them what's happening on stage so that they can time the voice to be exactly at the right moment. Clever stuff. On the subject of sound, we were told that most productions, about 70%, don't use microphones, the rest do, and that it's partly possible because there are oak panels around the walls which help reflect the sound back into the theatre. We were shown the triangular balconies where the musicians sit, up to the right and the left. At least they do if there are not too many of them. If there are, they'll have to be hidden somewhere on level 5 of the building, but they will still play live. And again, the musical director has a flat-screen TV on which he can see exactly what's going on stage and get the timings just perfect. 140 to 150 different lights, all automated from somewhere up on level 5, a fly tower so you can climb up to the lighting gantries, a large backstage area, of course, so somewhere where scenery for current productions is stored, for example. Scenery, we were told, is built off-site on the whole, somewhere on the edge of Stratford, where there's a scenic workshop. We saw some interesting things lying about. For example, 3 versions of the BFG puppet, a human-sized one, a tiny one, and a giant one, all needed at various moments in that production. They talked about the costumes and told us there are various places where costumes can be sourced, so some will be designed and made especially for a particular show. Some will have perhaps been made for a previous show and they can be reused or adapted a little, and some will be bought, not made. So if your actor needs jeans or a white shirt or something that it would be a waste of time to make from scratch, you go and buy it. And the whole theatre uses what they call the Green Book approach, which is an environmental measure, under which they commit to 50% of the costumes in any show being things which have been used before. 65% of anything in any show should be used again later. If you buy second-hand clothes, apparently that counts as used before. There are something like 16 people running the wardrobe section, and they have 2 main tasks. One is during the actual play, when each of them will be responsible for one or a small number of actors, and they will make sure that each costume is ready in the right place at the right time, especially when a quick change is required. And the second task is, of course, looking after all the stock, the maintenance of the costumes, laundry, repairs, that sort of thing. I definitely felt by the end of the tour that next time I see actually any theatre production, but particularly one at the RST, Royal Shakespeare Theatre in Stratford, I'll have much more understanding about how it's being done. Also, I went to reading and hunted out Judi Dench's book called The Man Who Pays the Rent, that's Shakespeare, if you're wondering, in which she describes lots and lots of moments through her career in the theatre. And I've picked out just 2 very short extracts to give a flavour of that. In the first one, she's talking about a production of Midsummer Night's Dream in 1962. and it illustrates the care and attention which goes into the designing of all the sets against which the plays are performed. This play, she said, had, quote, the most exquisite design by Lila de Nobili. The opening scene was set in a great hall, with 2 staircases that swept up either side of a central doorway. When it came time for the transformation into the woods, the whole of the top wall became gauze and was lit to reveal a forest beyond, and then Ian Home came running through the trees towards us as Puck. It was absolutely magical to watch. She goes on to talk about her costume from that performance, again, quite an insight. Quote, my costume was Elizabethan with a huge collar, and my wig was made in Paris out of yak hair. The bodice was boned, a dark brown colour, and the full skirt was gauzy and became tagged and mothy at the knee. Our feet were dirty and bare, which made us feel both aerial and of the earth, and it was easy to run about. Whenever we entered, we were always sniffing the air. We were feral. And in a second extract from later in the book, she's writing about the drama and how it's created on stage, those moments that you're never going to forget. This time she's talking about Cymbeline, in which she played the role of Imogen, and she's recalling a particularly tense moment which took place on stage. Quote, it's late at night. Imogen's in bed reading. Iachimo's trunk is in the corner of the room, and a candle is burning. She lays aside her book and goes to sleep. And then the trunk opens, and out creeps Iachimo, terrifying. His plan is to take note of the bedchamber, the pictures, the wall hangings, the chimney breast, the window, in order to trick Posthumus into thinking he slept with Imogen. But he needs more compelling evidence, so he tries to remove the bracelet from her wrist, the one that Posthumus gave her in the first scene. It's so daring. It's like that game with the metal ring, when you have to go round the wire without touching it and making it buzz. In our production, I think I might have stirred at one point, or rolled over. Can't you just picture the scene? And for a different take, bringing us back down to earth a bit, here's the actor Richard Sutton in her blog on the RSC website, in which he's talking about some of the work that goes into every production. Quote, an average day, looking over lines at breakfast, rehearsals 9 until 6, understudy rehearsals 6:30 to 8:30, learning lines 8:30 to 10:30. This continued 6 days a week for 5 weeks, plus costume fittings, movement sessions, voice calls with the wondrous Paula, singing rehearsals with the brilliant musicians. It was like a gym for creatives, exhausting, exhilarating, and utterly joyous. Something I haven't mentioned yet is the fact that there are actually 3 theatres in Stratford belonging to the Royal Shakespeare Company. The main one, which I've been describing, is the Royal Shakespeare Theatre, and the other 2 are the Swan and the Other Place. Yes, that's really what it's called. So, the Swan is next door to the main theatre. It's been created in the part of the original building, the one which burnt down in 1928, which actually survived the fire. If you go round the back of the Royal Shakespeare Theatre from the big grand front entrance, you will be walking past it. It opened in 1986, had a major refurbishment a few years ago, 2022 I think it was. It's a much more intimate space, 469 seats apparently, and we were told, we popped in there on the same tour of the main theatre, that actors often say this is their favourite theatre. It's also an Elizabethan-style theatre, so with what they call the deep thrust stage poking out into the audience. And it's mainly used not for Shakespeare works, but for other things, works by his contemporaries, modern plays, etc. And also, as part of this building, an exhibition, a permanent exhibition called The Thing. It's a little museum really, somewhere where you can see some of the many, many objects and costumes which have been saved on previous RST productions. I spotted, for example, the dress worn by Vivien Leigh in Twelfth Night in 1955, the costume which turned Juliet Stevenson into Titania for Midsummer Night's Dream in 1981, the Hamlet costume worn by David Tennant. There were lots and lots of props too, for example a skull which was used on stage in the 19th century. Not there, but the object of a story which the tour guide told us is a real skull from much more recent times than that. It belonged to one Andrzej Tchaikovsky, who was a Polish concert pianist and who bequeathed it in his will to the Royal Shakespeare Company in 1982 because he wanted to be part of a Hamlet production. He didn't manage it in life and he thought this might be his way of achieving it. They did take possession of the skull. I think they were a bit unsure what to do with it really. Was it tasteless to use it? Was it perhaps a good thing because that's what the man had wanted? In the end, it was used in the production of Hamlet in which David Tennant starred. The director, Gregory Duran, decided that he would use it in the graveyard scene, and it's said that he brought it along to the first rehearsal and introduced it as a cast member. The rules were that only people who really needed to handle it should do so. So David Tennant, yes, handled it on stage. I expect one or two people from the costume and props department did, but it was not passed around further than that. I learnt too in the exhibition about special effects. There was a bit, for example, with some ropes and a little sign that said, "Pull the ropes to make Ariel fly." So again, all sorts of ways of getting into the productions, behind the scenes a little bit, and seeing how things are made to work. They had other interesting things on display, for example, a copy of the first folio, and a set of glorious stained glass windows showing the 7 ages of man, so 1 pane of glass for each of the stages: infant, schoolboy, lover, soldier, etc. If you're in Stratford overnight or longer, perhaps to attend a play, I think it would be really good to find time to pop into the museum as well, or indeed to look out for a production in the Swan Theatre. Finally then, the third theatre is called The Other Place. It's the Royal Shakespeare Theatre's third smallest space in Stratford. It opened in the 1970s as a sort of tin shed theatre with just 200 seats. But it often caused quite a stir because it was reserved for new takes on things, a bit of experimenting, if you like. When the theatre critic from The Guardian went to see the 1975 version of Hamlet, I think that was the opening play, it starred Ben Kingsley and was played in jeans and shirt sleeves. And the reviewer's comment was that it was all, quote, totally unexpected. I think it's undergone 1 or 2 changes since then, and these days it's a studio theatre for, as they say on their own website, quote, new writing and intimate performances. A good place to bear in mind if you want to see a range of different things while you're in Stratford. Another place it can be interesting to visit is something called the Costume Store, which is housed in a mock Tudor building just opposite the Royal Shakespeare Theatre and the Swan Theatre. You might notice the initials CF above the door, which stand for Charles Flower, the mayor and rich brewer whose legacy it was that allowed the theatre to be built in the first place. And if you go there, you can hire costumes for plays, or just to wear to a fancy dress event, if you like. They've got 60,000 to choose from, apparently. I think you need to make an appointment to go, but it's very much open to the public. And among their range, they have, quote, historical costumes ranging from the ancient Greek, Egyptian and Roman empires all the way through to the end of the 20th century. We have contemporary costumes, fantasy and futuristic costumes, military uniforms from all periods. And a last way to find out much more about what's going on behind the scenes is the Royal Shakespeare Company's website. There's a particular section devoted to Shakespeare. When all the different plays are covered, you can look up the synopsis of the one you're going to see, search out some key quotes, read some notes about past productions. There's a biography of Shakespeare, a lot of information about his times, examples of background information which might be handy. So if you're watching a history play, for example, they'll tell you something about the real story on which it's based. So a good way to keep in touch even if you're not actually in Stratford at the moment. And finally, a last thing to visit when you are in Stratford, the Gower statue, situated prominently at one end of the Bancroft Gardens. So the Royal Shakespeare Theatre is at one end. Walk down the river through the gardens to the other end and you will see a large statue. Central figure is Shakespeare himself, sitting down with pen and parchment, and around him are 4 figures who represent his work. So for tragedy, there's Lady Macbeth. Falstaff represents comedy. The history plays, we've got Prince Hal, who of course later went on to be Henry V. And regarding other plays that don't quite fit any of those categories, his philosophy, if you like, Hamlet. Who else? So then, that brings me to the end of this third and final episode in the mini-series, and I hope you feel you've gained lots of information and ideas which will be useful if you want to go exploring the idea of theatre in Shakespeare's hometown. And I think I'm going to leave the last word to someone who loves Stratford very much and knows it much better than most of us ever will, and that's Judi Dench. She was asked in the question and answer section of the book that she wrote, "You love Stratford, don't you?" And this is her reply. "In all the memories I have, that's where my heart is. It's where I feel centred. So much of what Shakespeare talks about in his plays can be referenced to the countryside around Stratford. You can see the Forest of Arden of his imagination. You know he was in that school, played by that river, went to visit Anne Hathaway in Shottery, and ran out of his house in Henley Street. As soon as I arrived in Stratford to play Titania in 1962, I thought, this is where I want to be." Yes, a lovely summary of all that you can gain from a bit of time spent in Stratford. So that ends my Stratford-on-Avon mini-series. Can I encourage you to check back in a month's time when there'll be a brand new series starting? I'm not going to mention which it is yet, but just to say I went to one of the grand old capitals of Europe with a fascinating history and a very vibrant present. And I'm really looking forward to giving you lots of background culture and history and information to mean that should you go to this place, you'll be well armed to get lots out of your visit. And actually, even if you're not going immediately, that you'll find it interesting from a cultural, historical point of view. But I can't resist finishing with one more Shakespearean phrase. I asked AI how to say goodbye to you, and the suggestions were, "Adieu, fare thee well." Yes, he was the world's greatest playwright, so it's not really necessary to say, I couldn't have put it better myself. And on that note, may I bid thee farewell.